You want to know something that genuinely bothers me? Nobody teaches you how money actually thinks. Not in school, not at home, not in any of those motivation videos where someone stands in front of a rented Lamborghini and tells you to wake up at 5 a.m. and journal your goals and stay consistent. None of that gets anywhere close to the actual thing, the real psychological wiring that separates people who accumulate wealth from people who just work themselves into exhaustion their entire lives and quietly wonder why the gap never closes. And here's what makes it worse. The people who actually know, they're not talking. Not because there's some elite secret society protecting ancient knowledge. Not because they sat in a room and agreed to keep the rest of the world confused. But because the advantage of understanding something other people don't understand disappears the moment you explain it to everyone. The edge only exists because most people don't have it. And wealthy people, genuinely wealthy people, not lucky people, not inherited people, but the ones who built something from nothing or near nothing. They understand that asymmetry of information is itself a form of power. Machiavelli understood this 500 years before behavioral economics gave it a name. He wasn't writing about money directly. He was documenting something underneath money, something that wealth is just one visible symptom of. He was writing about how certain minds process the world differently, how they read situations other people misread, how they make decisions other people defer, how they position themselves in ways that make outcomes bend slightly in their direction over and over again, until what looks like luck from the outside is actually just a compounding of small psychological advantages most people never developed. Think about the wealthy people you've actually observed up close. Not celebrities, not inherited money, the ones who built something. There is a specific quality to how they move through the world that is genuinely difficult to articulate at first. They're rarely the most frantic person in the room. They don't perform urgency the way most people do. They seem, and this is the word that keeps coming up, unhurried. Not lazy, not disengaged. Unhurried, like they're operating on a timeline that nobody else can quite see. In certain conversations, they barely speak. They listen with a quality of attention that makes you feel slightly exposed, like they're reading something in what you're saying that goes beyond the words themselves. And then in other rooms, with different people, different stakes, they command the entire energy without raising their voice, without demanding anything. The room just reorganizes itself around them. That is not charisma. That is not luck. That is not a personality type you either have or don't have. That is a trained psychological orientation toward reality. And it can be learned. It can be built deliberately, but only if you understand what it actually consists of, which is what nobody explains. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince, "Never was anything great achieved without danger." But read that carefully, not as motivation, as observation. What he was actually documenting through years of watching powerful men succeed and fail at the highest levels of political and social power was that the psychological tolerance for uncertainty is itself a competitive advantage. The person who can sit inside an uncomfortable, unresolved situation without flinching, without scrambling for premature certainty, without needing resolution before it's ready, without collapsing into anxiety that forces a bad decision just to make the discomfort stop. That person operates at a fundamentally different level than almost everyone around them. That tolerance isn't courage exactly. It's something more specific. It's a trained relationship with discomfort. And the wealthy people who have it didn't develop it through positive thinking. They developed it through a specific series of experiences and, crucially, through a specific way of processing those experiences that most people never get taught. 3 principles today, not 3 tips you've heard repackaged, not 3 habits that sound good and change nothing. 3 fundamental psychological reorientations the actual internal shifts that wealthy, influential people operate from, the ones they learned either through painful first-hand experience or from someone who cared enough about them to refuse to let them stay comfortable in mediocre thinking. The third one is going to land differently than you expect. Most people hear a version of it and think they already understand it. They don't. The surface version and the deep version are so different they're almost unrelated. Stay through it. Before we go any further, like this video right now, share it with one person in your life who is ready for a real conversation about how wealth psychology actually works. Not motivation, not inspiration, psychology. Subscribe to this channel and do not skip any section. These 3 points are not independent. They are connected at a level that only becomes clear when you have all three. If this already feels different from what you usually watch, drop this below. I don't chase, I attract. Number 1. They understand that perception is an asset, not a vanity. Machiavelli said it in a way that made the powerful men of his era genuinely uncomfortable. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are, and those few dare not oppose themselves to the opinion of the many. Sit with that for a moment. Not because it's cynical, because it's describing something that operates in every boardroom, every negotiation, every first meeting, every pitch, every social interaction, whether money is involved or not. Perception isn't about image in the shallow sense. Perception is a functional economic asset, and the people who understand it that way, who manage it deliberately, strategically, consistently over time, operate with an invisible compounding advantage that most people never even recognize is in play. Here is where almost everyone gets this principle completely wrong. They think perception management is about appearances, about dressing a certain way, speaking with the right vocabulary, having credentials displayed in the right places. And yes, those surface signals do something at a basic threshold level. They clear a minimum bar. But that is the beginner's interpretation of this principle. That is what people who half understand this idea do. And doing it halfway, performing surface signals without the deeper substance, is actually worse than doing nothing, because sophisticated people read the performance and it erodes trust rather than building it. The deeper version of this principle operates at a completely different level. Wealthy people understand that every single interaction, every email, every phone call, every casual conversation, every moment where they choose how to respond to something, is either building or slowly eroding the story that other people tell about them when they are not present. And that story, that accumulated narrative, functions over time exactly like a financial asset. It appreciates with consistent investment. It opens doors before you knock. It generates returns in rooms you're not even in. It makes people extend trust they haven't consciously decided to extend, because the story of who you are arrived before you did, and did the work of establishing credibility in advance. Robert Cialdini spent decades in behavioral research documenting exactly how this operates at a neurological level. The principle he identified, social proof, authority, the way human beings automatically calibrate how much credibility to extend to someone based on accumulated signals about their track record, operates almost entirely below conscious awareness. People aren't sitting down and rationally deciding how much to trust you. They're feeling it. They're picking up on patterns that their brain has assembled from dozens of data points, most of which were generated in moments you didn't think were being evaluated. That last part is the key insight that most people miss entirely. Reputation is not built in the high-stakes moments, the big presentation, the important meeting, the situation where everyone knows they're being watched. In those moments, almost everyone performs reasonably well because the stakes are visible and the motivation is obvious. Reputation is built in the low-stakes moments. The email you answered at 11 p.m. that nobody expected you to answer until morning. The situation where you gave someone credit you could have taken for yourself. The moment where you stayed composed in a conversation that most people would have gotten defensive in, not because cameras were rolling, but because that's actually how you operate. The way you treated someone who couldn't do anything for you. The commitment you kept when keeping it was inconvenient, and breaking it would have been easily justifiable. Those moments feel insignificant in isolation. They feel like they don't count. And that is precisely why they count more than anything else. Because they reveal character in the absence of incentive. And character revealed in the absence of incentive is the most credible signal available. Wealthy people, the genuinely successful ones, have usually figured this out through experience. They've watched deals fall apart, not because the numbers were wrong, but because something in the relationship didn't hold. They've watched people with impressive resumes get passed over for people with stronger reputations. They've felt the difference between walking into a room where their reputation preceded them and walking into a room where they had to start from zero. And they understood which one felt like playing with a tailwind versus playing into a headwind. Once you feel that difference clearly enough, once you understand experientially that reputation is compounding in one direction or the other, regardless of whether you're managing it, you stop leaving it to chance. Now here's the dimension of this that gets almost no attention, and it might be the most important part. Wealthy people are just as strategic about what they don't show as about what they do show. This is sophisticated perception management, and it's where the real leverage is. The person who shares every struggle publicly, who performs their hard work, who makes their uncertainty visible to everyone, who explains themselves constantly, who is always bringing people up to speed on how much effort they're putting in. That person is managing perception from a permanent deficit position. They are always justifying, always explaining, always trying to close the gap between how they feel on the inside and how they want to be seen on the outside. And that gap, that visible strain between effort and outcome, reads as weakness even when it's meant to read as transparency. The wealthy mind does something different. It lets results accumulate quietly. It doesn't announce the process. It presents the outcome. It understands that strategic silence about certain things creates a gravity that oversharing systematically destroys. There is something about a person who doesn't explain themselves constantly, who doesn't need your understanding of their process in order to feel validated, that registers as power before a single word is exchanged. This is not about being mysterious for the sake of seeming interesting. It's about understanding that information is currency in social dynamics, and spending it all at once leaves you with nothing in reserve. Here's the practical application that changes things immediately. Stop explaining your decisions to people who didn't ask for an explanation. Stop justifying your choices to people whose approval you don't actually need. Stop performing your effort. Let the results speak. And when the results aren't ready yet, let the silence speak. Start treating your attention as something valuable enough to be selective with, because the moment you make your attention freely available to everyone in every direction, you've communicated something about its worth that will be very difficult to walk back. And start thinking about every interaction, even the small ones, especially the small ones, as a deposit or a withdrawal from a reputation account that has been accumulating since the first moment anyone formed an impression of you, because it has been, whether you knew it or not. Machiavelli wasn't being cynical when he wrote about perception. He was being precise. Reality passes through human psychology before it becomes anyone's experience of truth. The person who ignores that filter doesn't make it disappear. They just lose all control over what it does with them. Take control of it. Deliberately. consistently, without apology and without vanity, because this isn't about ego. It's about understanding that your reputation is working for you or against you right now, in this moment, in conversations you're not part of, and you get to decide which direction it's working. Number 2, they have a completely different relationship with risk than you think. Machiavelli wrote something that gets quoted constantly and understood almost never. Fortune is a woman, and if you wish to keep her under it, is necessary to beat and ill-use her. Before anyone applies a modern lens to that language, what Machiavelli was describing in the violent metaphorical style of 16th century political writing was the relationship between decisive action and uncertain outcomes. He was observing something specific about how fortune, luck, timing, circumstance, the uncontrollable variables that shape outcomes, responds to different psychological orientations. His argument was that fortune does not reward the cautious. It does not reward the patient waiter. It rewards the bold, not the reckless, the bold. There is a critical difference, and specifically, it rewards the person who moves decisively inside uncertainty, rather than waiting for certainty that will never arrive. Here is what wealthy people understand about risk that almost nobody else does. And this is so counterintuitive that most people hear it and immediately find a reason to dismiss it rather than sit with it. Risk is not the enemy of security. Misunderstood risk is the enemy of security. Read that again. Most people avoid risk because it feels dangerous. And on the surface, that is completely rational. If you can't afford to lose something, protect it. If the downside is catastrophic, avoid the exposure. That logic is sound in specific contexts, but when it becomes the operating philosophy of an entire financial and professional life, when risk avoidance becomes the default setting rather than a specific calculated response to specific high-stakes situations, it produces an outcome that most risk avoiders never see coming until it's too late. The absence of risk is not safety. It is a slower, quieter, more socially acceptable version of loss. Inflation erodes money that isn't growing. Stagnant careers get restructured out of existence when industries shift. Skills that aren't being pushed atrophy. Businesses that aren't evolving get disrupted. The person who spent 20 years making safe choices didn't protect themselves. They experienced their losses in increments small enough to feel normal, and that normalization of slow loss is one of the most dangerous psychological traps in the entire wealth conversation. Because here's the brutal math underneath it. The person who avoids a 30% chance of losing 20% of their investment also avoids an 80% chance of tripling it over 10 years. They didn't protect themselves from risk. They protected themselves from opportunity. And over a long enough timeline, compounded over decades, that protection from opportunity costs more than any single loss they were trying to avoid. Wealthy people have internalized this math not as an intellectual concept, but as a felt reality. And most of them got there the hard way, through a specific experience where avoiding risk cost them something significant enough to rewrite how they think about it permanently. Now here is the specific psychological reorientation that changes everything. Wealthy people don't ask, "How do I avoid losing?" They ask 3 different questions. What is the actual realistic probability of each outcome here? Not the emotionally inflated worst-case scenario my anxiety is presenting me, but the actual probability based on real information. What do I concretely lose if the worst realistic outcome happens? Not the catastrophized version, the actual concrete loss? And can I survive that? Can I recover from that? Does that loss end me, or does it set me back? If the answer to that last question is yes, I can survive it. I can recover. It doesn't end me. They move, without excessive deliberation, without waiting for a level of certainty that doesn't exist. without needing consensus from the people around them who are operating from their own risk aversion and projecting it as wisdom. That psychological sequence, probability assessment, concrete downside calculation, survivability check, decision, is a trained cognitive process. It is not natural for most people. Most people's risk assessment process is dominated by emotional amplification of worst-case scenarios and social pressure from risk-averse people in their immediate circle. The result is a systematic overestimation of downside risk and a systematic undervaluing of the cost of inaction. Wealthy people have usually broken that pattern, either through deliberate training or through enough first-hand experience with the cost of excessive caution that they rewired it involuntarily. There is a concept in behavioral economics called loss aversion, documented extensively by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in their work on prospect theory. Human beings feel losses approximately twice as intensely as equivalent gains. The pain of losing $100 is psychologically roughly twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining $100. This is hardwired. This is not a character flaw. This is biology. But here's what wealthy people understand that most people don't. Loss aversion is a cognitive bias, meaning it systematically distorts your perception of reality in a specific, predictable direction. And once you know the direction of the distortion, you can correct for it. Not eliminate it. It's wired in, but correct for it consciously. You can build in a deliberate adjustment. When your risk assessment feels like this is definitely too dangerous, ask yourself whether loss aversion is amplifying the downside by a factor of 2. And often, not always, but often, when you run that correction, the actual risk-adjusted math looks considerably different than your initial emotional response suggested. This is what sophisticated investors do. This is what experienced entrepreneurs do. Not because they're fearless. Most of them are not fearless. They feel the fear as clearly as anyone. But because they've developed the psychological discipline to not let the fear do the math for them. Now there's a dimension of this that almost never gets discussed in conversations about wealth and risk. And it might be the most practically important part of this entire principle. Wealthy people are not just more comfortable with financial risk. They are substantially more comfortable with social risk, with the risk of being wrong publicly, with the risk of holding a position that the people around them question or don't understand, with the risk of making a decision that looks strange to their immediate social circle, with the risk of being early, of seeing something before most people see it and moving on that vision before there's social proof that it was the right call. That social risk tolerance, the ability to hold a conviction and act on it without needing the approval of everyone in your environment, is arguably more important than financial risk tolerance in the actual accumulation of wealth. Because most people don't fail to build wealth because they can't access capital or opportunity. They fail because they can't survive the social discomfort of being the person who thinks differently, prioritizes differently, moves differently than the people around them. The person who has a business idea and doesn't pursue it because their family doesn't understand it. The person who sees an investment opportunity but waits until it's obvious to everyone, at which point the upside is already gone. The person who knows they need to leave a stable but stagnant career and move towards something with real upside, but stays because the stable thing is socially legible and the risky thing requires explaining. All of those are social risk failures dressed up as financial prudence. And they compound, quietly, invisibly, into a life shaped more by other people's comfort levels than by the person's own clearest judgment. Machiavelli saw this in the political advisors he studied, the ones who told the prince what he wanted to hear rather than what was true. They were managing social risk, protecting themselves from the discomfort of disapproval. And that self-protection cost them the one thing that would have made them genuinely valuable and genuinely safe in the long run. The reputation for honest, accurate counsel that makes you indispensable rather than replaceable. The person who develops real social risk tolerance, who can tell a hard truth, hold an unpopular position, make a decision that confuses the people around them, and sit with that confusion without internal collapse. That person has developed something that most people never do: psychological independence. And that independence, compounded over time, becomes the foundation that genuine wealth is built on, because every significant financial decision you will ever make will require you to hold a position that someone around you questions. Every important move will feel premature to someone. Every departure from the expected path will generate social friction. The person who can navigate that friction without being derailed by it will make better decisions more consistently over a longer period of time than the person who is always calibrating their choices to what's socially comfortable. This one's for you. Claim it. I calculate. I decide. I move. Number 3. They use human psychology not against people, but ahead of them. Machiavelli argued with characteristic precision. A prince must be a fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten wolves. Most people read that and immediately focus on the lion, the strength, the dominance, the visible, undeniable power that makes opposition think twice. And that's understandable. The lion is dramatic. The lion is satisfying. The lion maps onto the cultural story most people have been told about what power looks like. But wealthy people, the ones who actually accumulate and sustain influence over long periods, they read that line and focus on the fox. Because here is the truth about influence at the level where wealth actually moves. Real influence, the kind that opens doors, moves capital, changes outcomes, creates the conditions for wealth to compound over time, has almost nothing to do with force. It has everything to do with understanding how people think before they know you understand it. Moving through the landscape of human psychology with a kind of sophisticated awareness that most people never develop, because most people never stop to study the terrain they've been walking on their entire lives. This is the principle that separates people most dramatically over time, and it's the one that's most difficult to teach, because it requires a level of honest, unsentimental observation about human nature that most people find uncomfortable. We'd rather believe people are more rational than they are. We'd rather believe that quality of work speaks for itself and decisions get made based on merit. Those beliefs are comforting. They're also, at a functional level, wrong in ways that cost people enormously. Here is the foundational reality that wealthy people have integrated and most people resist. Human beings are not primarily rational. Not in decisions about money, not in decisions about who to trust, who to hire, who to invest in, who to support, who to give opportunities to. Not in any decision that matters. The emotional and psychological response comes first, always, reliably, without exception, and the rational justification comes afterward. We feel the decision before we think it. And then we construct a logical narrative that makes the feeling seem like the conclusion of a rational process. This is not a personality quirk. This is not a weakness in certain types of people. This is fundamental human cognition, documented extensively across decades of behavioral research, present across cultures and demographics and levels of education. The most sophisticated financial analyst and the most impulsive emotional spender share the same basic neurological architecture. The difference is the degree to which the analytical overlay catches and corrects the emotional first response. But the emotional first response is always there, always primary, always the thing that has to be addressed before anything else will land. The wealthy person who understands this doesn't use it to manipulate. That distinction is important, and it needs to be made clearly. Manipulation is using psychological understanding to get someone to act against their own interests for your benefit. What we're describing is something categorically different. It's understanding someone's psychology well enough to communicate with them in terms that actually reach them. To address what they actually need underneath what they say they need. To build the kind of genuine trust that makes transactions possible, relationships durable, and collaboration productive over time. The difference between those two things, manipulation and sophisticated communication, is both real and enormous. And conflating them is one of the main reasons most people never develop this skill. They're afraid of understanding people too well because they've associated that understanding with exploitation, so they stay deliberately superficial in how they read situations and people, and they wonder why their honest, well-intentioned efforts keep producing disappointing results. Here's where this plays out in the specific context of wealth accumulation. Most people lead with logic in financial and professional contexts. They build the case, they assemble the data, they prepare the rational argument, and then they're genuinely confused, sometimes hurt, when intelligent people who clearly understand the logic don't respond the way the logic would suggest they should. What they missed is the emotional architecture underneath the decision, the thing that has to be in place before logic gets a fair hearing. An investor who passes on a deal isn't necessarily unmoved by the numbers. They may be entirely persuaded by the numbers at an intellectual level, but something else isn't in place. Something in the interaction didn't generate the felt sense of trust that makes a person willing to put real money behind an idea. And without that felt sense, which is an emotional response, not a rational one, no amount of logical argument closes the deal at a high level. Trust is built through specific psychological signals that have to be present and consistent over time. Reliability, not just competence, but reliability, doing what you said you'd do when you said you'd do it, consistently, in small things before big things. Genuine interest in the other person's perspective and well-being, not performed interest, genuine interest, the kind that makes people feel actually heard rather than strategically listened to. Confidence that doesn't require validation from the room, the psychological steadiness of someone who knows what they're about and doesn't need you to confirm it for them. And honesty, including the specific kind of honesty that involves telling people things they might not want to hear when those things are true and relevant, because that particular form of honesty, while uncomfortable in the moment, is the single fastest way to establish the kind of trust that survives adversity. Machiavelli spent years in the Florentine court observing exactly how this dynamic played out at the highest levels of political and economic power. The advisors and allies who lasted, who maintained their position and influence through changing conditions, through opposition, through the kinds of turbulent circumstances that eliminated less psychologically sophisticated operators, were without exception the ones who had developed a deep, specific understanding of the particular human beings they dealt with regularly. Not a generic understanding of people in the abstract. A specific, granular understanding of this person. What actually motivates them underneath what they say motivates them, what they're afraid of that they'd never name directly, what they need to feel in order to act, whether they're driven more powerfully by fear of loss or excitement about gain, because those two psychological orientations require completely different communication strategies, and confusing them is almost always fatal to the outcome. Whether they need to feel like the idea was theirs in order to champion it, and if so, how to structure a conversation so that the idea genuinely becomes theirs through the dialogue rather than being presented to them as something they're being asked to approve. Whether they need public credit or whether they're motivated by private acknowledgement. Whether they respond to directness or whether directness triggers a defensive reaction that closes them off and requires a more circuitous approach to the same destination. This isn't being fake. This isn't manipulation. This is being genuinely sophisticated, genuinely intelligent about the fact that every human being you deal with is a specific person with a specific psychology, and treating every person identically is not fairness. It's laziness dressed up as principle. The person who delivers the same pitch, the same energy, the same communication style to every person in every context, regardless of who's on the other side of the table, that person is not being authentic. They are failing to bring their full intelligence to the interaction. Real intelligence in human contexts means reading the specific person in front of you and adjusting how you communicate, not what you believe, not your core position, but how you communicate it, to maximize the chance that what you're actually saying gets heard rather than just transmitted. Now here is the layer of this principle that connects most directly and most powerfully to the specific accumulation of wealth over time. Money follows trust, not talent, not necessarily even competence at its highest level. Trust. At scale, consistently, over long periods of time, capital moves toward the people and entities that generate the deepest, most durable trust in the people who have capital to deploy. The brilliant person who nobody quite trusts will always, eventually, reliably, be outpaced by the merely competent person who generates profound, consistent trust in everyone they deal with over time. This sounds deeply unfair. It probably is deeply unfair at some level. It is also completely, historically, reliably true, documented across industries, across cultures, across centuries of economic history. Because here's what trust does at a functional economic level that talent alone cannot replicate. Trust reduces transaction costs. When someone trusts you deeply, not just likes you, trusts you, they don't need to spend time and energy protecting themselves from you. They don't need elaborate contracts for every interaction. They don't need to verify everything you tell them. They don't need to bring advisors into every conversation to guard against possibilities they'd worry about with someone they trusted less. All of that friction, the time, the energy, the resources that go into managing risk in low-trust relationships disappears in high-trust ones. And the person at the center of a network of high-trust relationships operates with a structural efficiency advantage over everyone operating in lower-trust environments. Trust also generates referrals and endorsements that no amount of marketing can replicate. The person who trusts you deeply becomes an advocate. Not because you asked them to, not because there's an incentive structure in place, but because genuine advocacy is a natural expression of genuine trust. And those referrals carry a weight, a credibility, a conversion rate that cold outreach never achieves, because they arrive preloaded with the emotional trust that's already been established in the relationship between the referrer and the recipient. And trust compounds. The trust you build with one person through the specific, consistent, genuine behaviors that generate it gets communicated to people you've never met through the network of relationships around that person. Your reputation for trustworthiness moves through social and professional networks at a speed and scale that no deliberate self-promotion effort can match. Because people talk constantly about who they trust and why, about who delivered and who didn't, about who they'd stake their own reputation on by making an introduction. The wealthy person who understands all of this doesn't wait for trust to develop accidentally through enough time and enough interactions. They actively, deliberately, consistently invest in the specific behaviors that build it. And they do this with every person they deal with, not just the ones who seem obviously important, because they understand that the person who seems unimportant today is often the person who becomes critically important later. And the way you treated them when they had nothing to offer you is the most credible data point they have about who you actually are. Machiavelli's fox doesn't just read the terrain once. The fox maintains continuous awareness, continuous calibration, always reading, always adjusting, always operating with a level of situational intelligence that makes the landscape legible while it remains confusing to everyone else. That's the real psychological trick rich people never explain, not because it's a secret, but because explaining it requires a level of honest acknowledgement about how human psychology actually works, rather than how we'd prefer it to work, that most people find uncomfortable enough to avoid. Now here's the important truth. Wealth is not what most people think it is. It is not a number sitting in an account somewhere. It is not a portfolio of assets. It is not even financial freedom in the way that phrase gets used in motivation content, as though freedom were a destination you arrive at rather than a psychological state you build toward through a specific series of decisions and internal developments over time. At its deepest level, at the level Machiavelli was actually writing about when he spent years documenting how power accumulates and sustains itself across generations and across the collapse of empires. Wealth is a psychological state that precedes the financial one, always, without exception. The financial outcome is the visible symptom of an invisible internal architecture that was built first, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through painful experience, sometimes through exposure to someone who refused to let you stay comfortable in thinking that didn't serve you. The important truth about these three principles is not that they are strategies you apply after you've already accumulated something worth protecting. They are the foundational internal orientation that makes accumulation a natural outcome over time rather than an unlikely exception. Perception management is not something you start doing when you have a reputation worth defending. It is how you build the reputation that creates the opportunities worth defending in the first place. Starting now, in the small interactions that don't feel important, in the moments where nobody seems to be watching, in the consistent daily choices about how you show up that are building a story about you, whether you're managing that story or not. Risk intelligence is not a skill you develop after your first big win gives you confidence. It is the psychological muscle you build through a deliberate series of smaller, uncomfortable, uncertain decisions that happen long before anyone is tracking your outcomes. Decisions where you ran the actual math instead of the emotional amplification, where you checked the survivability of the downside rather than catastrophizing it, where you moved when the rational calculation said move, even though the emotional response said wait. And understanding human psychology, reading specific people carefully, calibrating how you communicate to who is actually in front of you, building the kind of genuine deep trust that generates economic returns for decades. That is not a social skill for people who are naturally charming. It is the foundational competency that everything else rests on, the infrastructure underneath the infrastructure, the thing that makes every other advantage compound faster and sustain longer. Machiavelli wrote his most important observations not for kings who already sat at the peak of established power. He wrote them for the person who was trying to understand what was actually happening in the room they were in, and how to stop being moved by forces they didn't yet fully see, and start being one of the forces that moves things instead. That is who this video was for. The person who feels the gap between their effort and their outcomes and suspects correctly. That the gap is not primarily about working harder or knowing more or waiting longer. The person who is ready, genuinely ready, not just intellectually curious, but actually ready to change something at the level where it matters. To look honestly at how they've been thinking and decide that a different orientation is worth the discomfort of building it. Your challenge this week is specific. Identify one real situation in your life right now, One relationship, one professional context, one financial decision you've been circling, and apply one of these 3 principles to it with genuine intention. Not theoretically, specifically. What perception are you currently not managing that you could take responsibility for starting today? What risk are you avoiding whose actual downside, calculated honestly without emotional amplification, you could survive? What person in front of you are you failing to genuinely understand because you've been communicating at them rather than reading them? Name it specifically, then move toward it this week, not next month, this week, and come back and tell me in the comments what you applied and what shifted. Those comments, specific, honest, real, are worth more to this community than the video itself, because they turn a passive watching experience into something that actually changes behavior. And changed behavior is the only thing that eventually changes outcomes. If this video hit different today, if something in here landed at a level beyond motivation, like it, share it with one person who is genuinely ready to hear it, and subscribe to this channel. Every week we go deeper into the real psychology of power, influence, wealth, and what it actually means to think at a level that produces different results than the level you were thinking at yesterday. This is not a content channel. This is a thinking channel, and thinking differently, consistently, deliberately over time is the only real competitive advantage that never stops compounding. See you in the next one.